Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Macrocast. I'm your host, Ylan Mui, and Managing Director at Penta. Brendan Walsh and John Fagan of Markets Policy Partners are here with me, as always, on a very snowy day in Washington. Now, typically, we spend most of the podcast talking about the economy and the markets, but this week it seems like all the political news, both here and overseas, have really taken center stage. So last week, we discussed the possibility of what Ian Bremmer over at the Eurasia Group is calling a geopolitical recession. And now we're sort of hearing that same sentiment echoed by Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic. He is pointing to political uncertainty as a potential risk factor to the soft landing that he's been sort of suggesting is underway in late 2023 through 2024. So, it seems like that could be a reason. I mean, it seems like it could cut both ways, guys. It seems like it could be a reason that the Fed ends up having to cut rates when the market expects, if the geopolitical risks sort of materialize. But it also, could be a reason the Fed might want to wait and to get out of the morass of political uncertainty before they make a move.
Yeah, geopolitical risk, Ylan, it's just a very difficult thing for the Fed to cut rates into, I think. There obviously, like, recession risk is kind of your classic, hey, we know what to do in that case, cut rates. But geopolitical risk is a completely different category. And what we've seen, obviously, in recent years is just how stagflationary these conflicts around the world can be, from the sort of energy as a weapon strategy that Russia employed early in the war, in particular, and the attacks on supply chains and shipping that the Houthis in Yemen are performing right now. And these really are the kinds of dynamics that delivered that gigantic inflation spike in 2022. And this is it's not clear cut, and certainly at the very least, it creates a lot more uncertainty around the outlook for inflation for the Fed. And the markets had been essentially at the end of last year pricing in extraordinarily high conviction in a soft landing, and that inflation would be so tame and so clearly defeated that the Fed would be free and clear to slash interest rates starting as early as March. But the consensus may not be wrong that we are headed for a soft landing and inflation will continue to go down. But the conviction is, I think we're just heading to a much lower conviction equilibrium, and the Fed is trying to express that through Raphael Bostic's, I think, prescient formulation here.
Yeah, and Bostic, what John and I were talking about yesterday, has really been a very good leading indicator now for a couple of years. He kind of pivoted to a little more dovish stance on inflation well before the core did. So I think, the market should definitely pay attention to his speech yesterday. And we talked about it last week after the producer price index. The December numbers were amazing. And so much of it was led, as it has been for the last 6 months, by actual deflation in the goods components, which then have been seeping through to CPI. But if you have to ship everything 40% farther to get it around the Horn of Africa, that's more expensive.
And this is in an environment where we have more CPI data incoming. I mean, more inflation data incoming next week is the Fed's preferred metric. The extrapolations from the data that we've seen suggest it should be pretty tame. But we're getting to that point where the year-on-year comparisons, the base effect, are looking less helpful. And isn't it always that, like, last mile, right? to go from 3 or 2.5 to 2. It's these are kind of the more difficult moments in achieving the targets, perhaps. And so this is where we've begun to see this week central bank officials like Bostic begin to put some calendar-based guidance out there. And typically this is different than data. It's different but related to data dependence. And data dependence, that has had been something that we've obviously seen Fed Chair Powell and the other FOMC members for a lot of last year talking about that data dependence. But this adds this element of, we're data dependent and we don't think we're going to get enough data until this particular period in time. We had Bostic come out yesterday and say that he didn't think that he would have enough data to feel confident about cutting interest rates until the third quarter. And that, that's a long way different from where the market's pricing. We had ECB, European Central Bank President Lagarde, come out earlier in the week and say that, the earliest she could see having enough information and data on the inflation side to feel confident to cut rates would be late spring, and implying potentially summer rate cuts being the earliest that they could get going. Now, things can change, but this is the kind of, we think that this is the kind of framing to add that sort of calendar element into the data dependence to give the markets a little bit more structure in the guidance and to incrementally push back on those, hey, they're going to cut in March expectations.
And also Bostic's time frame kind of fits with when the Fed caught the markets off guard, at the end of the year with their pivot. We kind of looked at the tea leaves and thought, oh, what probably happened was, they took a look at their 24 time frame of, growth and inflation and thought, oh, probably, like a mid-year cut would make sense. And then they looked, oh, we'll be in the midst of the election, and we don't want it to make it seem like we're doing this to help or hurt one of the candidates. So we better get this out of the way now, deal with the market probably overreacting to it, and then actually be able to do what we want to do. So it does kind of seem that, both the data and the market is now kind of coming back on sides with maybe what the Fed was initially thinking with that pivot.
Yeah, and on the political side, we'll talk a little bit more about politics in the context of the budget deal and the can kick that we saw. But no Fed officials are going to say it. But you've got, let's say the candidate on the Republican side is Trump. That former President Trump is very likely to win New Hampshire and then win South Carolina and then sew up the nomination. And he has a very, very reflationary, one would assume, based on, it's early days and the campaign hasn't really gotten, hasn't been super focused on economic messaging yet. But to the extent he has, it's tax cuts, lower interest rates, very reflationary. That's what President Trump is likely to do. That's what he did in his first term. And if you're a Federal Reserve official looking at, potential election outcomes, you have to factor in the possibility that you're going to have, one of the candidates is potentially going to be particularly in a reflationary and pro-growth economic model. And, I think that's they're never going to expressly say that, but I think it's going to be part of their thinking.
Yeah, I thought that Bostic did a very nice little two-step in his speech in which he gave that calendar-based guidance that you mentioned, John, of possibly cutting rates in the third quarter, but then also gave themselves a sort of data-dependent out in saying that if the inflation data is convincing, what is enough to be convincing? That's what folks are going to be parsing over the next few months, I'm sure, that maybe they could move earlier. So, they're not trying to say that they are not stuck or tied to a certain date, but if the data comes in and it's looking good, then maybe they could be persuaded. But the third quarter is an awfully convenient time when you look at the political calendar for making a decision. And John, when you talk about a reflationary environment under the likely Republican nominee, I mean, he's also talking about 10% tariffs on all foreign imports. Right. So, I mean, that's
pretty inflationary. It's very inflationary.
It's right there. Now, maybe we can't afford to buy as many things if there's a 10% tariff. But I think the Trump's convincing win in Iowa the sort of fight for a distant second between Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. Clearly there have to be gaming out the potential of what would a Trump presidency mean, both for the economy and for the Fed as an institution, right? I mean, Trump has compared Jay Powell to President Xi of China, and not in a good way.
Yeah, I think that would be a really interesting question to ask, assuming that he is the nominee. Would you fire Chair Powell and put in someone who's going to cut interest rates? He said, in interviews that interest rates are way too high. Nobody can do anything. And he's a debt guy. He's a real estate guy. Loves low interest rates. What's not to love about low interest rates if you're in that business? So, I think that we'll learn.
Well, actually, I did look up the Fed Act. He's not allowed to fire him from the Fed, but he is allowed to replace him as chair. But if you got replaced by chair, you would kind of figure you'd probably quit.
That's yeah. Right. It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. And there were the minutes of, or not the minutes, but the so I guess transcripts of the Fed's meetings back in 2018 that came out over the past week, when the Fed was under sharp criticism from former President Trump. And the Fed studiously avoided, apparently, according to these transcripts, any mention of the president in their meetings or any sort of hint that they might be considering the political calculus in any of their decisions. That being said, they may not explicitly say it, but you have to imagine that it's in the back of their minds. I don't think it's possible to ignore the political environment.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be the elephant in in the room for some of the upcoming FOMC meetings, and they will, as you say, try to studiously ignore it. But the independence of the Fed, it's one of the most, if not the most powerful institution in Washington, aside from the White House, and some would argue that it's more powerful than the White House, right? And so. The temptation, what hasn't been politicized, what neutral institution in Washington, D.C. hasn't been politicized at this point, right? And so, there aren't that many. So
I realized when we were having our discussion last week and sort of thinking through what former President Trump's impact on the economy could be if he were to win again, that I actually didn't know a whole lot about Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis's economic plans. Ron DeSantis sort of made his name for fighting the corporate wokeism battles. But their economic plans feel fairly traditional, I guess. Sort of standard Republican, again, cut taxes, cut income taxes. Nikki Haley wants to get rid of the federal gas tax. She's also going after SALT, which I thought was interesting. Not going to win her a lot of votes in the suburbs if she's counting on that sort of more moderate voter. Right, if she wants to get rid of the ability to deduct state and local taxes from your tax bill, so that's one that she has on her agenda. But they did not seem to have anything that would be surprising or perhaps disruptive to what we would expect from a fiscal picture from a Republican. Trump's plan for 10% tariffs on foreign imports, of course, that would be something that would be very difficult to model and could be a bomb on consumer spending. But the others seem to be fairly middle of the road.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that really is picking up in terms of the interest again is the deficit. We are looking at, what was it, 34 trillion we just hit. Is that the latest milestone? So either both parties are both parties are not covered in glory when it comes to fiscal conservatism and over the past few years. But we have seen a appreciation that something has to be done, but what has to be done is not a campaign trail kind of discussion. If any of these candidates have any sort of plans to tame the deficit, it is not something they're going to be touting in the general election. When asked about it, they are going to they're going to if you're a Republican, you're going to say the tax cuts pay for themselves, which is just a punchline. It should come with a rim shot. I mean, it's such a joke at this point. And if you're President Biden, controlling the deficit, who knows what they're going to say on that front if asked. But it's, entitlement reform. These things are like not something that are going to win votes, and it's all about the election these days. So it's something that may be on the to-do list once the election is over. But we shall see.
Well, I think the frustrating part for, people who care about the fiscal trajectory of the country is that, it's not just on the campaign trail where people make promises that they can't keep, right? It's even when they pass the laws, even when the Congress tries to build in incentives for them to, stay on the fiscal high road, that they can't seem to make it happen. So if we think back all the way to last spring, or was it summer? I can't remember now. It's all a big fog. But when the Fiscal Responsibility Act was passed, when then Speaker Kevin McCarthy cut the deal with Democrats in order to lift the debt ceiling and to at least keep the lights on for the federal government, part of that agreement included an automatic sequester, an automatic 1% cut to defense and non-defense spending compared to FY23 levels if Congress didn't do its job and pass full year appropriations bills, if they didn't, actually go through the process of figuring out how money is going to be allocated to each government agency. And so they try to create an incentive for themselves to follow the rules that they themselves did agree that they should be following. And yet here we are on what is today, January the 19th, and Congress still can't get its act together. They still can't write the appropriations bills in order to fund the government, fund federal agencies at the levels they had previously agreed to. And so that means that we could be facing a pretty dramatic cut in government spending come April 30th. So every time that lawmakers try to kick the can down the road of government funding, every time they just pass a continuing resolution or a stopgap funding bill, they're getting closer and closer to the real deadline, which is if they can't get it done by April 30th, then we're going to see some dramatic spending cuts, and that could have a real impact on economic performance.
Right. Yeah. And for, some members of the Republican caucus, that's a feature, not a bug. Right.
Yeah, well, true. But, the way that this was designed was so that when you actually look at the amount of the reductions, 1% across the board, but the impact would be greater on defense spending than it would be on non-defense spending. So Republicans almost knew that they would find themselves in this bind. And so they're sort of the defense spending that they have argued for so long needs to be maintained and even increased. That would face a bigger cut than the other types of spending that Democrats have put a greater priority on. So, it's just incredibly frustrating to see that they can't even follow the laws that they passed themselves. But again, that deal was struck at a time when the dynamic in the Republican Party was very different. And the guy who cut that deal is no longer on the Hill.
These are never easy, but this one kind of should have been one of the easier ones because of the way that we do the accounting. Like all the COVID stuff was running off anyways, but you get credit for it running off. So, optically, we were going to lower it no matter what, but we still can't even come to some sort of agreement, even with the fuzzy accounting.
Ylan, I'm curious, we always criticize the can kick. Oh, another CR for 6 weeks, just a temporary Band-Aid, and we're going to be back at this. However, maybe Speaker Johnson is looking at his cost benefit analysis, and he knows that he's going to, whatever he wants to do a deal. He's actually, made some pretty constructive noises about the, keeping the top line agreement that they had and so forth. And the closer we get to the general election, the less likely that the Republican, even the far right, will want to do a big fight, will oust him and want to do another big fight over the speakership. So who knows? Maybe he's maybe he's got his eye on the calendar as well and trying to pick his spots so he can make a decision that's going to be unpopular with a lot of his caucus and still survive.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I mean, maybe he's also saying, hey, the closer we get to April 30th, the better chance I have of actually getting folks to write these dang bills, right? And agree on them, because then you have the real sort of axe hanging over your head with the potential of that 1% sequester. But I also, if you look at who voted against the continuing resolution in the House, who voted against keeping the lights on through, March 1st and March 8th, Elise Stefanik was on that list, right? She's chair of the House Republican conference and has been rumored as a potential running mate for President Trump. You've got Jim Jordan, right? You've got the Freedom Caucus folks who are against him. So at this point, they're still willing to. Jody Arrington, also the head of the House Budget Committee, voted against it. So you have folks who are have a lot of sway within the Republican conference who voted against this deal. You have folks who are also thinking about their political futures and trying to position themselves, for a potential Trump presidency. And that may mean, standing up to Speaker Johnson. So I'm not really sure how those dynamics are going to play out, because I think there could also be a lot of value to bucking the speaker politically for some of the members.
Yeah. And it just like the way you get bills passed, as you're talking about, is the calendar. We don't have a year. You actually have like 12 days to actually pass things. And that just gets totally amplified in an election year,
Yeah, and there are efforts to try to take a step back and to think more holistically about how we should be approaching the question of debt and deficits. There is this bipartisan, I think it's called the Fiscal Commission Act, that has got support from some moderate Democrats, that's got support from Speaker Johnson, as well as, House Republicans. So maybe there is a path there for something that could get done, and that would essentially, create another super committee with members of both parties as well as outside groups to try to come up with a resolution out of this mess. But that still feels more symbolic than anything, than a real effort to, rethink the way that we approach our debt. But at least there's a symbolic effort going on, right? There's a recognition that the process is broken, as evidenced by what's going on.
The first step to recovery is admit you've got a problem.
Right. 12-step process.
Yeah. But at the end of the year, John and I were thinking of, predictions that, probably won't happen, but could. And one we came up with was that if the Biden administration wins, Biden will be well into his mid-80s, and most of the senior people on his staff will be at the end of their career. And he kind of already passed all the big things that, can get passed. So actually, if there's a chance for entitlement reform, Joe Biden's your best chance. He could have a Nixon to China kind of moment. And especially with Social Security, ironically, that's an easy one. You just raise the retirement age, and we're living wrong. So longer. So there is precedent for it. But that's probably your highest chance in the short to medium term of anybody addressing it, because probably our next president is going to be younger, and that's political suicide to be in your mid 40s and try to cut entitlements.
Yeah, on that Nixon and China thing, essentially in the entitlement arena, if a Republican president tried to do it, the Democrats would form an impenetrable wall of opposition.
Yeah,
and it would. Because it would be just too politically, it would just be too politically enticing to do that, and it would be a winner to beat them up on that. I think you can only have someone who's sort of left leaning, common person, bona fides are as rock solid as President Biden's, and a Democrat who can drag over moderates from his party. Into a bipartisan. We've seen him do bipartisan legislation that's very difficult, and obviously he is, and he is not particularly well regarded by the far left of his party, and so he's not going to, be running
Doesn't
left
care.
in a lot of in his last term, I don't think. So there's a real possibility of, way out of the money option of the stars aligning for something real on entitlement reform, sensible entitlement reform that can really be part of his legacy. But I don't think a President Trump could do it. I don't think he would want to do it necessarily, and I think that it would be something that the Democrats would just make too much political hay over.
But well, we're not predicting that's going to happen. I can guarantee you that that's not going to be the centerpiece of his election campaign.
Definitely not.
This is a little bit of a tangent, but I was listening to NPR yesterday, and they brought up the excellent point, which I had not really considered, is that because people are living and working longer, this is one of the first time, maybe the only time, that we've had 4 generations all in the same workforce. We still have boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z all working together. So I'm not sure whether to be excited about the fact that, that there's this wealth of talent to draw from, or sort of depressed about the fact that we're working longer. And so therefore we could be working with our grandkids.
No, we were talking about that lunch yesterday. I mean, the amount of medical breakthroughs that are happening, it's kind of underreported, but it's kind of going parabolic. So Jen and I were saying we're kind of maybe in that perfect zone where we'll probably be able to live to 100 very, healthily, happily, but we're too old where it gets really crazy, where then, we might live forever and have to decide whether you want to kill yourself or not.
Well, this has taken a dark turn. So.
Well, I mean, if you want to look at people working well into their 80s, boy, look no further than Congress and the politics. I mean, come on.
Nancy
don't you have anything better to do in your golden years? You really want to sit in those hearings?
I know. Nancy Pelosi is coming back. I thought she had already said she was retiring.
No, Steny Hoyer. Was it Steny Hoyer? Yeah, Steny Hoyer said, I think he's going to run for another term, even though he stepped down from leadership positions. All right, John.
Graceful exits are very hard to perform in certain fields.
In Congress, in rates, in anything.
I know.
All of it makes
Retire, go get on a board, work 4 days a year, and get paid a couple $1 million and go fishing.
Keynes' vision will never come true. I have a feeling. At least not in America.
Yeah, I mean, you get the idea. Well, you're in Congress long enough, and you begin to think you're indispensable. What's the old saying about indispensable people? The graveyards are full of indispensable people. All right, on that grim note.
Let's on once again an even darker turn. Let's look at what's happening overseas, guys.
Yeah, that's way darker.
Yeah, I know, right? That's happier.
U.S. economic outperformance just continues to be the theme, with the retail sales coming in strong, and the last non-farm payrolls data showing the robustness of our labor markets. We got data from China earlier this week. It was really squishy and not particularly exciting. There was a sense that the GDP number, was maybe massaged a little bit, but how much are they really massaging these? And these numbers are not good, right? They hit their target of around 5% growth last year, maybe, but that is not exactly shooting the lights out. And there was nothing in the data that came out from December that was particularly encouraging. Lots of weakness in retail. The property investment is still in free fall, it seems, and they just have endless headline risk. Shadow Bank went belly up and liquidated, one of the biggest, and this just seems to keep happening.
And the CEO was arrested.
Yeah, and on Wall Street, right? You've always got the dramatic underperformance. Chinese stocks, U.S. stocks were up like double digits last year, and Chinese stocks were down double digits. So it's got to be now. It's got to be the bottom in here somewhere. Yeah. That kind of thinking is always
index is just a disaster for 5 years.
Yeah. Right. I mean, that's essentially been the sell every rally has been the right posture toward that. And what's looking like it's going to get better in China. And then when you cast an eye over to Europe, They had essentially a technical recession. Germany was in like technical recession at the end of last year, perhaps. And, the purchasing managers indexes for January are coming out next week, and they're likely to show, continued just doldrums in Europe and, and weakness in manufacturing in the U.S., but strength in services.
And of course, we
got a bunch of wars.
Brendan, we're trying to get out of the dark turn, Brendan. We're trying to dig ourselves out of the dark place. But of course, the other thing that's going on internationally, of course, is Davos. And I have to give a shout out to our colleagues who are over there, including Penta's president, Matt McDonald, as well as Stacey Kerr, Andy Whitehouse, Colin McDevitt, all some of our partners discussing the role of AI. It seems like that was really the theme of Davos this year. And Penta's own conference, Penta's own panel, discussed the role of AI in terms of how that could change the jobs of C-suite executives, and whether that could even mean that C-suite executives might feel some type of risk from the technological advancements that AI could bring. So
and I think you guys did a great job of kind of being ahead of the curve on it. Because just watching this week, it seems like every day a new company is announcing a round of layoffs that is directly related to efficiencies gained by AI. And the jobs that are lost aren't the blue collar ones. They're replacing the pretty good paying jobs.
Yeah, this is so interesting. I mean, we talked about this a little bit too when Michael Strang was on the podcast, but this idea that, the Industrial Revolution changed the way that we think about physical labor and the way that physical labor is done. We don't need as many people, right, to do it. AI could change the labor of knowledge, and we can use AI to sort of do some of the sort of basic functions of knowledge work today. And so really the people who will succeed are those who can layer on that deeper analysis or deeper critical thinking, but it does mean you might need fewer people, right? And I don't
get
think
you to the 80 or 90 yard line, and then you need, an expert to take it the rest of the way. But that's a lot of work that's replaced. And also that the AI does it a lot quicker than the humans had done it in the past too.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that our president, Matt, had said was that, he doesn't really see like an AI robot running a company, right? I don't think that's the future that we're. My
10-year-old son's very worried about this. We have to have talk.
This is not the Wizard of Oz.
Running companies, but running the world.
but to the degree that AI, if you don't leverage it correctly, are you missing risk? Can AI help you see around the corner? Can AI help you be more efficient and productive? And as a CEO, if you don't leverage that, then that's how you might be affected, and that's how you might lose your job, as opposed to being replaced by a machine, an LLM.
Yep.
So fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and it's just the beginning innings of this. I don't think we fully understand just how kind of new this technology is.
Absolutely. So lots more to discuss, both going on at Davos and, of course, on our podcast. But that does it for us this week at the Macrocast. I'm Ylan Mui with Penta. My co-hosts are John and Brendan of Markets Policy Partners. We hope that you enjoyed our show. And remember, you can always listen, like, and subscribe to the Macrocast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.